Welcome to Six of One and Bill of the Other, the only podcast you will ever need. Today, we're going to be discussing what for me is the Disney Plus show, Pistol, but Bill will tell me that elsewhere in the world it is not a Disney Plus show. Where did you see it, Bill?
I had to watch it on Hulu, and I was so annoyed by the commercials that I ended up purchasing a month's subscription. In fact, I will interrupt briefly to tell you that the first episode I watched before I got the premium was presented by Minions, The Rise of Gru, a Progressive commercial, the Chevy Blazer, some hockey show, Google, Love, Victor, which is a Hulu show, Corona, the beer, not the disease, Hyundai, Carvana, eHarmony, Motherland for Salem, or Fort Salem, which was so bad I really thought it was a parody, but it's a real show, Michelob Ultra, Priceline, and, ironically enough, Disney Plus.
What was that list?
That was all of the commercials I had to sit through to watch the very first episode of Pistol on Hulu.
Holy hell.
Before I paid for the...
Right,
and some of them are doubles.
I thought that's what you were saying. In the old days when I used to watch commercial TV, ITV over here, in the 80s and the 90s, in an hour, you would get an ad break every quarter of an hour. So you'd probably, in an hour show, you'd have 3 or 4 adverts. What did you just list? How many?
Whenever I think of punk rock and anarchy, first thing that comes to mind is Minions, The Rise of Gru.
Well, I'll tell you what. When I think of the Pistols, Sex Pistols, the first thing I think of is this is a show destined for Disney Plus.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, because over here that's the big selling point. It's Disney Plus. People are signing up, or for the Beatles and for the Sex Pistols, signing up to Disney Plus to watch the Sex Pistols.
Isn't it funny that our first 2 episodes are tied together with Mickey Mouse and heroin?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Oh, and by the way, Bill, you left us with a kind of it was like on a precipice at the end of the last episode. I have been waiting with bated breath and gritted teeth so much that I've actually misaligned my bottom teeth. So, Bill, it was something about laconic.
Laconic. So this is our fun fact, history fact of the day. So I heard this from Hardcore History, which sounds like a really bad pornography, but it's really a history podcast, which is really good. I would recommend it. Anyway, laconic is a short phrase, which usually contains a high amount of wit. So if you think of like the cowboys of Westerns and everything, and how it's like, walk softly and carry a big stick. You don't say much. You're a tough guy. You just get things done. That was started by the Spartans who lived on Laconia. People who've played Assassin's Creed Odyssey are like, yes, I know. Anyway, so my little fun fact takes place after the Peloponnesian War. So Sparta is not what it once was. It's a smaller, smaller country. They're not as formidable as they once were. And Philip of Macedon comes to them. Now, Philip of Macedon was one of the greatest generals to ever live, but he's overshadowed by his son, Alexander the Great. So Philip of Macedon comes to Sparta and says,
if I invade there, I will turn you out.
And that's exactly what he says, which sounds like a 90s R&B album. Like, I think that's a Johnny Gill song. She turned me out. Anyway, so he says to them, yeah, I guess you wouldn't. Belle Biv DeVoe. Anyway, so he says to the Spartans,
if I invade, I will turn you out.
And the Spartans, being the badasses that they were, they sent him back a message, one word, if, which is a pretty badass thing. And it would be even more badass if the Philip of Macedon didn't immediately invade them afterwards and wipe them off the face of the earth. And I find that a lot of like Spartan stories sort of end like that. Like they do something real cool and tough, and then they're brutally killed. Like if you remember, when the Persians came in and he said, "This is Sparta," and he kicked them off, and then he was brutally killed. So that was my fun fact. Laconic. I don't think either of us could be described as laconic. But, so I guess the fun fact, kids at home, the lesson is don't talk crap because you'll be brutally butchered.
And then we'll meet Malcolm McLaren.
Was that worth waiting for? Was that worth waiting for?
No. This is Pistol, a TV show directed by Danny Boyle, 6 episodes. The first episode of which I watched, and as I was watching it, I think I texted Bill to say, this might be an interesting show to talk about. My initial reaction, I'll just get it out of the way now. My initial reaction was, oh dear. I've got to say, I'll put it out right out there now. By the end, I thought it was a worthwhile watch, and I did quite like it. And we'll move on to talk about it in more detail. What was your kind of overall view, without giving away too much? What was your overall view of it?
I like Danny Boyle. I like Train Spotting, and I like the sequel a lot. I sort of have a dislike of band reenactment stuff. I like documentaries. They had one part in this, and I guess we'll get into it later, but there's always that part in these sorts of things where they're going, smoke on the fire and water in the sky. And the guy goes, wait, hold on, man. What if you said smoke on the water and fire in? And they're like, yeah, man. And they start doing the groove, and then they like switch over, and they're in Wembley Stadium playing it in front of everybody. And there was a lot of that. I felt like the first episode, I get what they were trying to do. They were playing a lot of current songs from the era, David Bowie stuff, to give you a feel for the kind of things they would listen to. But there's a balance there. Like, I almost thought that I might have accidentally put on a classic rock station and had it playing in the background while I was watching this.
What did you feel by the end? What did you feel by the end? Because a lot of things, what you were saying, we'll go into. I've got some headings for that, and we'll go into it in more detail.
In the end, I liked the story of the band, and I was interested in the band. I didn't really like the actual show. Not that it was all bad. There were parts I liked, but taken overall, I would have much rather watched a really good documentary about the band.
I suppose I should get it out there now that the Sex Pistols were one of my favourite bands of all time. And when I was a teenager, I was in a punk band, and I used to wear a padlock around my neck. I used to wear the same T-shirt that Sid Vicious used to wear in some of the most famous pictures of him. I had every Sex Pistols album. Obviously, there's only one, but there's loads of bootleg live albums. You got the whole Great Rock and Roll Swindle monstrosity. I had the Winterland final gig on VHS tape. I was gonna go and get it so I'd have it in the background of this podcast. But I had all the original recordings of Glenn Matlock live. I had everything. So to hear that they were releasing a TV series on Disney, with my knowledge of the band and all the connections to the sex shop and Malcolm McLaren, Vivienne Westwood,
What
the
did
whole
you
Nazi
think of
regalia thing.
What did you think of Donald Duck playing Sid Vicious? I thought that was a strong choice. When Donald Duck carved "Give Me a Fix" with a razor blade in his chest, that really took me back.
I could see if they had done that, if they had done this show as everyone, like we were talking about with the Hound of the Baskervilles, where I read the version where Mickey Mouse was Sherlock Holmes and Pluto was the Hound. If we'd had Mickey Mouse as Johnny Rotten and maybe Donald Duck as Sid Vicious, I think we could have done the show. I just don't know about what we'd have done with some of the sex scenes. Does anyone want to see Mickey Mouse having sex or Donald Duck having sex?
Have I just walked onto another podcast? I'm not commenting on that, good sir.
I thought so. I agree with a lot of what you just said. I spent a lot of the time picking it to, even as it was playing. And I've got to say, before this podcast, I just rewatched it all again.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
So I've just watched it through twice because the first time through I didn't take any notes. I was watching it.
Oh, I took notes.
And on the second time through, I liked it less, not more. But as a show, I would, before we slag it all off now, I'd recommend people watch it because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, especially with the direction. It's a very pretty depiction of the 70s, the most grimy era in modern English history, specifically where it comes to portraying the 70s in this show, the mixing of real documentary footage. And this went through all 6 episodes, but the mixing of real footage with the filmed stuff for the show, and by the end, they really are switching it between. I thought that was, I've never really seen that. I can't remember seeing that done before in one of these kind of shows.
What
did you think?
I've seen it in The Departed. I can't think of Scorsese movie. where they showed at the very beginning where they're showing the riots and everything in Boston before they cut to the real thing. And
Did it do it throughout?
Not throughout, just at the very beginning.
This one was throughout, if you know.
It's
odd.
throughout, and what kind of, not to be contrarian, I didn't like it, and here's why. I liked the footage from the 70s, and I liked showing that. But then what happened is you have 4K HD footage, and I'm sure if I did research, I'll find out that they did some kind of film thing that's really complicated. But to me, it almost looked like they did a kind of Final Cut Pro setting on it to make things a little bit more, 70s looking. And I probably wouldn't have minded it, but by showing it right next to actual Super 8 footage, it really, the quality difference, it really made it apparent that, hey, this is a modern day camera that we're putting effects on to make it look more like it.
I thought the overall look of it, with those visual effects and things, and he did so many things. There was a couple of moments during it where he was doing that bullet time around, just momentarily around characters, Matrix
when they were
style.
spitting on each other, and they were all...
Loads of completely unnecessary things. He chucked everything into the mix. It sounds like I quite liked the overall vibe of the 70s they were trying to give you with using the documentary footage, and you weren't so keen. You would have rather not have any real footage from the 70s.
No, I would say I liked the documentary footage, but I would say it did bring out sort of a lot of the tools he was using on the modern day footage to make it look more 70s, and it sort of took away the mystique from me. I didn't think it was as bad as, and I haven't watched the Queen movie, but I heard a lot of people making fun of it for being really bad about sort of, how unrealistic they portray it.
Well, let's not go too much into authenticity, because that's the next heading.
Yeah, okay.
Look, I heard someone slagging off Stranger Things, right? And they were saying that, oh God, we get it. It's the 80s. We get it.
Yeah.
Like, stop it with the clothes and the video games and the lights and everything. We get it. And I thought that was a bit, because I haven't watched the latest series, but I remember watching Stranger Things, and I remember quite liking that overly set up 80s vibe. And I remember the 80s, and it kind of was like that.
Well,
I think it's a shame when someone makes the effort to portray the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, and then some clever dick will go, yeah, but
Well, I think what's really difficult with this particular sort of band biopic is the whole thing the Sex Pistols were about was authenticity, and not having the bells and whistles, and not having the fake plastic front, which is obviously ironic with, Sid Vicious later saying it's how I look that matters, not what I'm playing, when that's the antithesis of what Johnny Rotten or Johnny Lydon was kind of about. So I think you're going to...
Not Malcolm McLaren, though.
Well,
that's the
he's
problem.
The exact opposite, yeah. And I think, when you're basing your whole band identity on that, this sort of thing that you're talking about is how much of it is sort of a puff piece versus what really happened is going to get in greater focus just because of the nature of who the band you're covering is.
Exactly, but the Disney Plus version of the Sex Pistols, directed by Danny Boyle of, he did that, did he win the Oscar for the million, what was it called? The one with the kid doing the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire thing. Was that Danny Boyle?
It might have been.
Slumdog Millionaire.
Oh, yeah, I think he did. Or I don't know if he won the award. I don't really follow that. But I did watch it. It was good.
He did the Olympics as well over here, the opening Olympics
oh, wow.
thing. That was really good. He's a talented guy. This is a little bit like a fairy tale. He's taken the story and he's just telling it in his own way. And he doesn't really care how realistic it is or how true to life it is. He's just telling
making the
his version.
Archetype of who they are is what they're making.
Yeah. So I wondered because I suppose you haven't said yet whether you were ever a Sex Pistols fan.
Yeah, I always saw them kind of from afar, and I had a lot of people in my life who were huge punk rockers, and I think I tended to be more into like thrash metal. Was sort of the closest I got to punk, which obviously has a lot of its roots in punk rock. And then my producer, when I was in Hawaii, was in a band called Christian Death, and he was with Perry Farrell before they formed Jane's Addiction.
Oh, wow.
And was huge into it, and he had a lot to say about sort of modern punk and things, and I can get into that maybe a little later. But I always sort of viewed it from a distance, and I would say one thing that this show, and then me following it up and looking at more things, uh, proved to me was I kind of didn't really think much of John Lydon, or I always called him Johnny Rotten, so I feel like I'm
Johnny
pronouncing
Rotten.
his
Stick
last
with
name
Johnny
wrong.
Rotten.
Yeah, I'll
He
stick with
doesn't
Johnny
like it.
Rotten. He doesn't
would,
like it.
if he was in the room. No. It's John.
Well,
Lydon.
I was gonna say I
But
like him,
stick
so
with
it's
Johnny
is it
Rotten.
Lydon? Is it Lydon?
Yeah.
So John Lydon.
Lydon.
When I came into this, there's sort of, when you get into punk rock and provocateurs, there's sort of a mixture of two things, in my opinion. There's sort of a malignant narcissism that kind of prevails with, I'm going to do what pisses you off, and I'm going to say it's for something, but it's really about me getting attention. Like that
Yep.
time where you did a bunch of discovers with your shirt off. No, in all seriousness, in all seriousness, it's
I'm not wearing anything on the bottom half right now.
yeah, you're always doing stuff like that just for the attention. But then you have the other end of things, where I would say, like Sinead O'Connor tearing a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live because she's against the Catholic Church's treatment of abused children, which is a complete selfless act because she's really gonna almost lose her career, and she got death threats. I always thought John Lydon was sort of on the narcissist side, and this is from me from afar. And watching this and then watching interviews from him, I did a complete turnaround, and I think he's more on the Sinead. I think he is who he says he is, and this is just me from afar, and I really like him and respect him the more I learned about him. And a lot of criticisms I had of like what I knew of punk rock from growing up, he kind of says the same things, and it was surprising to me. So I'll say one thing I found watching this, and I kind of just knew I knew Anarchy in the UK from a Megadeth song on So Far So Good So What, so it was very from a distance.
With very, very misheard lyrics on it. Dave Mustaine
Yes.
needs to clean his ears out.
Yeah. But I'll say, if nothing else, a newfound respect for John Lydon and everything was what
Very clever
what I
man.
got from watching this.
I think he was making every effort to disassociate himself from punk during being the singer of the Sex Pistols.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Well,
Very
actually,
strange man.
no, and that's kind of what I found one of the things I found interesting with him is for music about anarchy, and you don't have to follow the rules. There sure is a whole lot of rules, and everybody sort of wears the same uniform. And this is from afar. I know there's exceptions, but the leather jacket with the spikes and the spiky hair and all that stuff. And he was saying from the beginning that no, that's not. It's about doing what you want. And what you want doesn't have to be this very narrow sort of set of rules that got established around the time that bands like him and Black Flag and all that stuff sort of really came to the forefront.
When you talk about punk, you are talking about like the Ramones and the Pistols and like Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys and the Clash and the Jam, I suppose, and the Buzzcocks.
But I
for
love the
me,
Buzzcocks.
The Buzzcocks.
Tom introduced me to the Buzzcocks, and I think
such a fantastic, probably my favorite punk band. But then it depends what you call punk. Do you
because
know what
they
I mean?
kind of have some poppy. Yeah,
They're a pop band, but a mighty fine pop band. But the Sex Pistols, to me, are the greatest punk band.
Sure.
Just everything about them, and I can imagine all the American, because like the difference between UK punk and American punk is so striking. I mean, you had Malcolm McLaren skitting between the two because he'd already managed the
New York Dolls.
New York Dolls,
Yeah.
kind of. He's an interesting character himself. I think the Sex Pistols kind of had it all. They had the best music and the best punk image, probably because it tied in with the fashion. I mean, who else has like a fashion designer basically in the band, kind of? With
Well,
Vivian
and that's
Westwood
something, and that's something that Tom would go into, where when you talk about modern pop punk and things, he didn't like it. And his thing that he would go into is back then they would make their own clothes, and from the sex shop, you take this sort of fetish outfits and you sort of make them into your uniform. And now kids go to Hot Topic and they buy, and so it's really the one of the oldest versions I've heard of the argument for cultural appropriation, where he's saying they're taking everything we believed in and just ruining it. My argument for those kids going to Hot Topic is people need to find themselves, and sometimes the best way to find yourself is to try different things. And so I don't hold it against especially younger people that want to sort of try
what did
on
you
these
call
things.
what did you call modern punk? Were you talking about Green Day and that at the time?
Yeah, like Green Day. I'm trying to think of. There was a lot
because
of
I was
bands at the
wearing
time.
I was wearing a padlock around my neck, right?
Yeah.
to try and look like Sid Vicious. I was the worst
Rancid
case.
was another group.
Well, do you know what? When you talk about like Rancid and that as well, I
Yeah.
remember like looking. I don't really remember the music, but I remember sort of seeing them, the image of them.
Yeah.
A lot of those bands were absolute cliche punks.
Yeah.
Like they bought all brand new punk
Yeah.
with punk things.
Yeah.
But I was doing that a bit myself. So it's hard to be too critical.
Well,
I think
sure,
when you're
and-
young, you don't even realize what you're doing until
I
you
would
get to my
argue-
age.
I would argue the biggest punk things for probably our generation would be grunge. Because I would
Yeah,
think,
that
you
was-
get,
that
and
was punk.
especially you've got Nirvana, but especially like acts like Mudhoney and Sonic Youth, and it was that we're doing things ourselves. We might not be able to play our instruments as good, even though there were acts that were fantastic musicians. And at the time, there were the Sex Pistols were sort of reacting about that really overproduced 1970s virtuoso recordings and saying, "Hey, I can play 3 chords, but I've got something to say." I think grunge sort of did that, and I would argue that rap, sort of hip hop, is an extension of that. And as a middle class white guy, you go, no, but think who don't your parents want you to listen to now? And it's not punk. And so I think there's certain elements that they took from that too. So I don't think what outgrew from punk is necessarily guys with spiky hair right now
No.
playing 3 chords in basements.
What you've said is exactly what I've been saying over the course of 156 Discover videos, which is, I think the punk was a spirit of a zest, a joy de vivre, which meant that the Jam, the Clash, and the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks all sounded completely different
Yeah.
because punk was just. I think there's a line in here where the actor who plays Steve Jones says something like, "Play the chord like you're punching him in the face,"
Yes.
and it's kind of like it's the spirit. So,
Which did you think that was surprising for him coming from the Monkees, being that bad joke? Sorry, that's a bad Davy
was
Jones.
that a Davy
joke.
Jones, Steve
That was
Jones
a
joke?
Davy Jones.
He was
that
doing
a joke.
he was doing a Davy Jones. He was pretending that he'd misheard the Dave Jones.
Take
was
the
listening
last train to Compton, and I'll
But I've
meet
said
you
it.
in the morning.
I'm a believer. I'm a believer.
Do,
Destroy.
do,
Destroy.
do, 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 do.
I was listening to Yeezus by Kanye West, right? And to me, that was a punk album.
Oh yeah.
Then I was listening to this, and I mean, I've got some people agreed, some people disagreed. Then listen to this Whole Lot of Red by Playboy Carti, right? It's like a hip hop thing. It's a punk album.
Yeah.
People are still making punk, but it doesn't need to be played with guitars and drums and things. It's a spirit.
Well, and
And
you know what's
Nirvana
funny?
was punk.
Well, what's
Bleach
funny
was
is
punk.
if you think about it, if you knew how to play an instrument and people started playing grunge or punk, what would the argument be? Oh, they can't even play their instruments. And what do they do with hip hop? They go, they're not even playing the songs. It's just samples.
Exactly.
They're not as technically proficient as us. And to me, the idea with music was always, I want a voice. I don't have a voice, and I want a voice. And sometimes you don't know, and it's like you do whatever you can to get out there. And if people respond to it, well, it's working, in my opinion.
Yeah. So to go back to the show,
Okay.
I don't think it captured the Sex Pistols story accurately, but I don't think it's what Danny Boyle was going for. I think if he listened to this podcast right now, I think he'd be coming back at us and saying, I wasn't trying to show it accurately, guys. You could tell that. I was just trying to be entertaining and capture a little bit of the spirit of punk.
Do you ever watch The Big Bang Theory?
I watched all of it. All of it.
Do you
During
think that
COVID.
Do you think that this show is the Big Bang Theory version of punk rock? In other words, people who aren't into punk rock will be like, "Oh, that's what those guys are." But if you're actually into it, you're like, "This is nothing like we are." Because I find like with nerds, that's the Big Bang Theory.
Do you think that someone who's not into the Sex Pistols or not into punk would actually, well, okay, let's assume that they do choose to watch it. They wouldn't, but let's assume they do. Do you think they'd like it? Because I think he is doing what you just said. He's making a version of the Sex Pistols, this band that the youth of today may have heard of.
Yeah.
And he's showing, and he's trying to show them I think he's syrup coating it a little bit, sugar coating it, but he's trying to say, maybe it's a band that he loved. I don't know, and he's trying to say, look at this, look how amazing they were.
It's a hard question to answer just because the newest season of Stranger Things, and not to spoil too much, I'll just say there's a couple songs that they use.
Well, no, they must have used running up that hill.
Well, Run Up the Hill and Metallica's Master of Puppets.
Yeah,
and
I've heard of that.
Because they've used it, a lot of people that never were into either song now are checking out the bands for the first time. So it's possible. I don't know how much of Middle America is like on TikTok going, oh, let's learn about the guy with rotten teeth.
They've always worn the
you know-
t-shirts, haven't they? Though, have you noticed that if you look at Instagram or whatever, over 10, 20 years now, you'll
Yeah.
get kind of cute teenage girls dressed in Slayer t-shirts and have thrash metal usually t-shirts, and you know that they've never listened to that band.
Yeah.
And some people get angry about it. I've never minded that. I can see why they do it.
Yeah, I never minded it either. Well, and there's a lot of gatekeeping happening with music, and I just think we're gonna die someday. If you find something you enjoy and it makes you feel good, have at
and
it.
If you want to wear a Slayer t-shirt and you don't know who Slayer are, be a bit careful.
I guess, and not to
Be
be
a bit
too
careful, but yeah.
not to be too self-important, but I never found myself wanting to be. There were times. I remember my first concert. We had these terrible like outfits, and I had the hair over my face and stuff, and so there were times. But for the most part, I never wanted to join a group. Like I never was like, yeah, I agree with everything. And this goes even with politics. Like, yeah, I agree with everything that group says. And I just felt like that made no sense to me. And not even as like a I'm cool stance, just like I didn't understand how we're so complicated. How do you agree with everything somebody's about? So when it comes to like fashion and stuff, I was just always boring, I guess.
Now
I feel like I brought
no. I'm just about to bring us all back down to earth with a very, 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 very positive comment here on this show. Something that by putting the caption on the screen now, for those of you who can't see it but listening, I put the caption music on the screen.
Or if you're like Steve Jones and you're illiterate.
You can't. Yeah. That which we'll get onto in the next caption, which is the cloak of invisibility. The music I thought was great, right? Because I've never seen this done before. I don't. You might be able to correct me. You'll probably think of examples, but the music on this show was all played live by the actors, and no overdubs. Actually recorded live, and you can tell. I was watching it again today, and there's certain points, especially the very early stuff, where Steve Jones has miraculously learned his guitar in 4 days.
You know, from what did he take? What drug? Meth or something?
Yeah, don't give me. We'll go on to that in a minute, right? And then the others walk into the room. And he plays that Stooges riff, and then Paul Cook actor joins in on the drums, and then the Glenn Matlock actor starts playing the bass. You can tell it's all for real. The actors couldn't play the instruments; they learned them for the series, kind of like
in real life.
Yeah, and I thought that was really good. That they didn't go down that route of just.
And I hate to do this, but yeah, they The Doors by Oliver Stone. That's Val Kilmer actually singing in the movie soundtrack. And I would say that actually Not to Touch the Earth, the version from that movie, is my favorite version of the song.
He's great. Did you hear the story? I've actually got The Doors written down for a point later, but did you hear the story that I think it was Ray Manzarek or John Densmore? I got Robbie Krieger. I'm just naming.
Let me interrupt you real quick. Norm had a great joke where he goes, Ray Manzarek dead at 68. The curse of the Doors. Sorry.
I see what you're doing there. That's almost like the Hound of the Baskervilles curse.
Yeah.
Old man Baskerville died at the age of 97. Old billionaire died from the curse. One of them, I think it was Ray Manzarek. One of them said they couldn't tell the difference. They listened to Val Kilmer singing a version, and they thought it was Jim Morrison.
That's
and they had to be told, no, it's not. It's Val Kilmer, and they were like, holy shit. I watched a massive YouTube documentary on the Doors. I watched it about 4 days ago, and it was about an hour long, and it was slagging off every single part of that film because people hate that film. And
I love that film, by the way.
But that film, I think,
and that film is probably not true at all, and I love it. I
right?
love it.
So
yeah.
I think it's interesting because the reasons I love that film, because it's a fairy tale version of The Doors. The reasons I love that film are some of the reasons I like this series, in that this is a fairy tale version of the Sex Pistols. And so to talk about the music, the fact that they did that, the Johnny Rotten bloke singing, right? Whether he sat, I thought overall the idea of making the actors play the songs for real. There's a few bits later where it's really weird. The bit where they're recording, never mind the bollocks,
Yeah.
in the studio. Very strange decision. They play the actual studio recordings, and the singer, while he's recording, sings over the top, and you can hear Johnny Rotten underneath, the real Johnny Rotten.
Which you really can't do. That's karaoke, right? I mean, I've
It's
never heard of
karaoke.
that.
But because it's so obvious, you can hear the original recording, and he's singing over the top
Yeah.
in the studio. And if you notice, towards the very end of the series, they start to switch between the real Sex Pistols and the fake Sex Pistols. And for just momentarily, it's the real Johnny Rotten on stage, and then they flick back again.
Yeah, I did notice that.
There was lots of clever little things going on where
Do you think
Danny
they're
Boyle's
banking?
just.
Do you think they're banking on you not knowing how recording works? Like when they're
I-
playing the actual vocals over
I
while you sing?
It was so obvious. I think everything was intentional, and I think he's just saying, yeah, that's the real. I think he was. It starts off with our actors, and by the end, we're starting to
Yeah.
mix to the point. A bit like the Elvis. Have you seen the Elvis film?
No, I'm
The
not
Baz
a big Elvis
Luhrmann
guy.
Elvis film.
Yeah, I'm not
You're
a big Elvis guy.
Oh, I see. I'm a big Elvis fan as
Yeah.
well. But that's similar in that, not to give. I don't want to do any spoilers. He dies.
On the
He
toilet,
gets
of
fat.
all things.
He gets fat.
Yeah.
Not to do any spoilers, but Elvis gets fat.
Where
Right.
him and Jim Morrison meet.
But yeah, kind of. Imagine a very messy orgy between Elvis and Jim. But by the end of the Elvis film, it becomes the real Elvis sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
But so what? So okay. So I've just
So I have
spoken and
I've-
spoken and spoken. What did you think about the way that the music was basically played live throughout?
I liked it. There were a couple points that bothered me. Him learning guitar in 4 days.
That's going to be the next.
Yeah, so I
point.
won't get into that. In fact, I do want to get into something with the name, the Sex Pistols, which actually the name of the store that Malcolm McLaren and his wife Vivian Westwood owned, I believe, was called the Sex Shop.
It's just called Sex.
It was just called Sex. So it's based on that, but it was interesting if you think of Sex Pistols because it's love and death. And I'm going somewhere with this, but there's a lot of early psychologists talked about the interplay subconsciously, the life, death, rebirth archetype, thing where sex and death are sort of intertwined together. And as a kid, a lot of slasher movies would have the girl would be, naked and then she'd get killed. I'm going somewhere with this. She'd get killed like right after, so it's interesting, the interplay. And in particular, I remember one film when I was younger, where these teenage girls were in the mall, and at midnight they were trapped in the mall, and these robots got loose. They were security robots, and they attacked them. And there was one scene that I remember as a kid watching, where the women were running topless, right? And from behind the robots, laser shot, and they blew their head off, which is a really kind of a messed up thing to see at 12 for your sexual development. And I have to say, to this day, when I'm with my wife alone, in order to, I have to have robots shoot her head off. I'm sorry. I've been holding on to that for 2 weeks.
I mean, everyone has their own ways of getting a kick out of life.
It's very expensive.
I mean, all these you have to build these robots.
Oh, don't get me started on the logistics and covering up our murder every time and cloning my wife. It's but I actually said that to her 2 weeks ago and got a laugh out of her. So I'm like, and then all this time goes by. So I wanted to make sure I got
You're
that
thinking,
in.
must remember it, must remember it, must remember
But,
it, must remember
yeah.
it, must remember it.
But how they handled the music, getting back to that, and I think that matches the spirit of the group, having them try to learn just like that he learned, in particular Steve Jones. And we'll probably get into it later. I loved how supportive some of the members' parents were. The drummer, who was Paul Cook, I believe,
Paul Cook.
and Glenn Matlock, the original bass player, both seemed to have really supportive parents. And I love the little story about how they'd let him play the drum set in their bedroom. As a parent myself, I just thought that was really cool. And they'd go to his shows and they're like singing, F Authority, and the parents are in the background cheering for him. I really like that. And there was one note I made because as I was watching, I was making notes. And Ron, who is, I think, is Steve Jones' parent, his father. There was a point where he was slagging him off because he was a blue collar worker. And so in my notes, I wrote, he should apologize to Ron for making those rings, because I think he made rings to sort of like, and then in parentheses, I put, never mind, he's a pedophile.
So, so you wrote that note. You wrote that note at the very first time he slagged the.
Yes. Yeah. And then in parentheses, after they showed that he sexually abused him, this is, never mind.
Yeah, that's the danger, isn't it, of making a comment too soon. Yeah.